I'm going to be doing something a little bit different this evening. The past couple of free events I've done have been focused on personal statements, just to kind of show folks what I'm doing inside my LSAT Unplugged courses. Because for most of my career, of course, I've focused on the LSAT, but I've also helped my students with their personal statements. I've more recently instituted that as a formal program within my course I'm calling Personal Statement Workshops. So if you look on the law school admissions playlist on my YouTube channel, LSAT Unplugged, you'll find a couple of public personal statement workshops I've done to give you all a taste of what I'm doing there. Another thing I do in my courses, and I've been doing this for nearly a year, is group coaching. I call this a mastermind program because I'm supporting everyone. Everyone in the group is supporting each other as well. And this is not simply tutoring. We're not simply going over specific LSAT problems. Obviously, I do that in my courses. It's a given, but I also coach. And I consider coaching different than tutoring. It's more than simply tutoring because it's not just about the problems. It's not just helping you understand how to apply strategies. It's also about knowing why the strategies work, helping you understand the exam on a deeper level from the test maker's perspective, as well as helping you get to the question behind the question. Sometimes it's not just about answering your direct questions, it's helping you lean into asking better questions. So I like to play a game sometimes where I don't actually answer the first question you ask. That's a surface level question sometimes, and I want to push you to think deeper. So we'll get into the coaching in a few, but before we do that, I want to start off just by sharing 5 critical LSAT coaching distinctions I bring to what I do. The first is serving you rather than pleasing you. And this means, again, not always directly answering the question being asked, but helping you ask better questions instead, pushing you to get to what's underneath the surface, what may be truly holding you back. And that may be occasionally uncomfortable for everybody involved, but it's only in the interest of serving your true LSAT goals and helping you reach your fullest potential. I also aim for what I call action over perfection. A lot of times I find perfectionism can creep into your LSAT prep, and that can lead you to avoid doing anything at all or to obsess over getting questions wrong, when in reality, getting questions wrong can be the best thing that ever happened to you because it helps you better understand your weak areas, better helps you understand what's truly giving you trouble. And if you're getting everything right, it means the questions you're doing are probably too easy for you. Even people who understand the test extremely well, myself included, we're not getting perfect 180s all the time. But if you understand the questions really giving you trouble and you focus on those and get accustomed to getting things wrong, that can help you get over the hurdle that prevents you from even moving forward sometimes. I also focus on understanding versus measuring. I don't want you to focus on simply getting more points or simply getting more questions right. Your LSAT prep process while you're studying is not an athletic competition. The real task at hand is to better understand the exam, and I want you to think of that as an end in itself. Obviously, the LSAT is simply a pit stop on your journey to succeeding in your legal career, to getting into law school, to graduating, the bar exam, and so on. There are many, many things after this. But I want you to truly, at least for the next month or 2 or 3, whenever you're taking the LSAT, between now and test day, focus primarily on understanding the exam from the test maker's perspective and actually developing a true appreciation for what this exam is all about and what goes into creating it. I also want you to think about understanding versus application. I talked earlier about blindly applying the strategies versus understanding why the strategies work. So not simply practical, but also theoretical. Theoretical can be useful too. And practical is obviously better a lot of times. It could be more efficient sometimes. But if you understand the exam on a theoretical level, that can sometimes help you derive the correct answer without having to write anything down or even have to evaluate the answer choices. You may actually come to the correct answer even before you look at the choices. That's what pre-phrasing is all about sometimes. Finally, 180 versus anything else. I never see any reason to aim for anything less than a 180. I'll have people apply to work with me and they'll talk about aiming for a 160 or a 165 or a 170. And I'll push back sometimes and I'll say to them, why not go for a 180? The students I love working with want to truly understand everything. And I understand that it may not always feel achievable. And obviously very few people actually achieve 180s, but that's a place to come from, not a place to get to. It's a place to come from, not a place to get to. Meaning that is the attitude you bring into your prep. Every single time you sit down, aim to understand everything and don't walk away from a problem until you truly understand it. And a week from now, a month from now, a year from now, you would still know how to approach that problem and you would still get it correct. So those are 5 LSAT coaching distinctions I bring to what I do. It's what I'll bring to what I do this evening with all of you as well. Now, in response to my email earlier today, many of you responded saying that you were open to getting some LSAT coaching from me. And so I'm here. Let's do it. If you're open to that and you emailed me, please raise your hand and turn on your video camera so we can really connect with each other. There's a raise hand function in Zoom, so please use the raise hand feature so I know that you're ready to work with me. Alternatively, if you don't see it or it's easier for you, simply type in the chat so I'll know to be on the lookout for that. I see Ian has raised his hand. So Ian, I'm going to ask you to unmute yourself if you're able. If not, just let me know and I'll do it for you. And let's play. What's going on for you?
I think I'm struggling mainly. I go through. I've used your like 2-month daily study guide, everything like that. What I really struggle with though, even when I sort of redo and do again a lot of the logic games, I still don't get all of the inferences that I need to. Just going into it, I'll know the right answer after I've looked through it, but I don't think I can intuitively connect with that initial like understanding that inference. So I'd love your input into that.
Okay, sure. So tell me more about where this comes up.
So in particular, I really struggle mainly a lot of the time with basic sequencing games and then in-out games. And I do a lot better on what is like considered like the more advanced games, like, you know, advanced linear, all that kind of stuff. But when it comes to things like very basic sequencing games, they tend to have 7 questions, and especially those, if you took away a rule, which rule would supplant it and all that kind of stuff. Those are the sorts of questions where even when I think that I have the inferences down, I sort of like shut down at that point. I don't think I fully understand where to go from there.
Okay, so what does your inference making process look like when you start a game?
So initially, like creating the actual game board, putting the pieces on the left hand of the page, and then creating the actual game board and trying to create whatever chain or the logic, whatever might follow from that initially. But when I get to maybe like the 4th or 5th question, I always feel like there must be something I'm missing here, all of that. And then once I like go back, do a blind review, I'll be super confident in my answer, and then I'll find out, oh, I got it wrong.
I hear you. All right, so who else here tonight is experiencing a similar issue around logic games? Just raise your hand, nod, smile, give some indication to Ian that he's not alone in this, if that is true for you. Yeah, so I see a few folks agreeing with you there. This is a common experience. So you're definitely not alone in this, Ian. Now, how many minutes do you spend on that initial setup, making inferences before you dive into the questions?
Usually too long, to be honest. Probably like 3 or 4.
3 or 4 minutes. Okay.
Yeah.
That seems pretty reasonable to me. And you mentioned ordering games, conditional in-out games. You also talked about rule substitution, which comes up in all different game types.
Yeah.
Because it seems like a pretty broad issue for you here. Now, let me ask you this. Do you need to make all the inferences up front? And what does making all the inferences mean?
So I guess I don't, to your point, I don't need to make all of the inferences. I guess what I'm struggling with is I always think when I'm at that 4th or 5th question, there must be something that I'm missing when I take that first pass onto it. And I think that just like going through each individual question and all that, there's always something where, when I see something that I've gotten wrong at the end after doing a blind review, I always think like, oh, like if only I had thought of that, like in my initial prep, I would have been able to get that question right.
2 things occur to me. One is, do you do the game's questions with the questions within a game in the order given? So I'll start with that one.
Yes.
Okay. That's something I want us to revisit, the idea of maybe doing them in a different order. Second thing is sometimes inferences won't always come to you. And it's not always automatic that they would come to you. Some things are just random where you would never naturally derive that inference up front. So it may not even be realistic. The second thing is, let's have a plan B for if you don't make every reasonable inference up front, in part because part of it comes down to personal preference. Sometimes you may make a ton of inferences up front, and that's fantastic. Other times you may not see it, and that's okay, but you could have seen it. So in those cases where you could have seen it but didn't, what can you do differently?
I think that my first inclination is always to try and think like, okay, if only I made the game board slightly different or something like that when it's a particularly hard problem or something. But
no, I'm going to cut you off there because that's a what if. That's like a wishing pie in the sky sort of thing. Let's be real here.
Sure. Yeah, it's a tough one to answer initially. I'm not entirely sure.
That's fine. You don't have to know. That's what the community is here for you, and I'm here for you too. So who has an answer for Ian? Who has an idea for Ian about what he might do differently? No wrong answers here, just playing. It's okay. I know it's scary. This is a new format for everybody.
My name is Jackie, and something that I've found is that sometimes simpler is better for the inferences because it's worse to make an incorrect inference and then act upon it. So just making sure that you have at least the bare bones skeleton that's a working piece, and not expecting that you're going to have an epiphany and just solve everything in 2 minutes, because you don't necessarily need to do that to get everything right.
That's excellent. Thank you for that, Jackie. I would agree 100%. You don't need to have everything to get everything right. That's a huge insight there, meaning that sometimes what you have could be enough. It may not be all the inferences in the world. Another idea is to use previous work. So if you approach the questions out of order, you will maximize the number of valid hypothetical scenarios that you have available to you to later help you solve those more general global questions that involve major inferences, like what in general must be true or what in general cannot be true. Sometimes you'll make the inference up front. Sometimes you won't. Sometimes it's a natural thing that half the people could have done and did, and half the people didn't see it. But other times it's something so random and so little that you would never even think to get it up front. And that's fine. That's where those previous scenarios come into play. We also have a comment here from Emily in the chat saying, try to separate out the limiting variables, which is a great strategy for making inferences up front. Emily, would you want to share more on that? Feel free to unmute yourself if you like.
So I was actually more commenting on the last part of what Ian had talked about, which was the rule substitution questions that come at the end. Not the first part, but usually when I have those sorts of questions that I'm looking at, it'll be a situation where they'll be talking about two pieces, but then a third piece might have been involved either between them or on both of them. And so that's a sort of limiting variable that would need to be accounted for in a specific way in the answer choice. And so I don't know if I worded it quite correctly, but that's what usually helps make those kinds of questions faster for me.
Well, thanks for that, Emily. And by the way, I have a ton on rule substitution questions. Any of you who are in my course, I have plenty there. I also have plenty on YouTube and my LSAT blog as well. So if you just search rule substitution or equivalent rule on my YouTube channel or blog, you'll find plenty there as well. I know we have a conversation coming up soon, Ian, as well, so we could talk more about it then as also. Anything else on your mind, Ian? Anything else we could support you with?
I mean, that is my primary concern right now. I'm totally willing to open the floor up.
Awesome. Well, thank you for joining in. I appreciate it. I know, Dana, I know that you had a question related to logic games and inferences. Would you want to share more?
Yeah, I think it was pretty similar in nature to the issue that Ian brought up, but maybe I might even be like a few steps behind. I just don't feel like I have a good process for identifying inferences, and that I maybe don't allocate enough time. I mean, I spend roughly, I think, 3 minutes as well trying to come up with inferences, but I find myself moving quite slowly through questions sometimes, like having to diagram literally every answer option to try and get to find the answer to a question, which seems pretty ineffective. And so I like often question whether I found all the right inferences. And so I just don't really have a good process, and I don't really know when to feel comfortable to like move on from my setup and start tackling the questions. So yeah, pretty similar in nature to what Ian was talking about.
And how long have you been studying for?
Probably about 2 months, but varying in intensity. But
Okay, how many games? How many games have you done?
I have definitely lost count. I've focused mostly on logic games during the past 2 months though. And now I'm doing a lot more like just general practice through Khan Academy. But my focus has almost always been logic games when it comes to the self-guided study.
Okay. Okay, good. So you've used resources, and that's mostly more the theory. I mean, they have drills, they have examples. What about working out of the actual LSAT exams and just doing sections once you've gotten that foundation?
Yeah, I've done a few sections as well, just like timed individual logic game sections. And I guess part of the problem is that I find myself performing better when I'm practicing versus when I'm taking the actual test. So part of me thinks that it's just like nerves and that I'm like very conscious of time. So I'm moving too quickly when I'm taking it under timed conditions. But even when I've tried to be like cognizant of that, when I'm actually taking a full practice test, I'm generally not doing as well as I did in like drills and under timed conditions.
Okay, so there's accuracy, there's pacing, and there's endurance. That's one of the frameworks underlying my LSAT study plans, both inside the course and outside the course. And so it sounds like accuracy is good when it's individual sections or individual games, and it's outside of the context of a full-timed exam. So part of this may just be getting used to the rhythm of the timing with sections, strict 35 minutes in that context, and then in the context of all the other stuff going on. So if you're saying full exams, I'm assuming that means reasoning and reading comp as well are in that mix. Is that correct?
Yeah.
And you said you've done a lot of work on games, but maybe not so much on the other stuff.
Yeah.
So in what way could doing a full exam with the other stuff mixed in, how could that impact your performance on everything?
Yeah, I see what you're saying. I think like the mental endurance is a big factor for sure. Just sitting down, especially with the time tests that I take through Khan Academy, those are a full 3 hours. It's not in the flex format. And so there's just a lot more like exhaustion. And so that could definitely affect my performance in the logic games. I'm not going into them as sharply. Yeah, and maybe just general anxiety about the other sections as well might be impacting my performance in the logic games.
And when are you taking the exam?
I'm set to take it on the at the end of August, but I'm not super attached. I think it really depends how much my performance improves over the next few weeks.
Okay. And so what is your plan for the next few weeks?
Yeah, so currently my like foremost plan was just to continue with Khan Academy and doing like generalized study, because I was starting to think that maybe my like underlying strengths are really with reading comprehension and the logical reasoning. And so that I should start trying to like study for those sections formally. And so I have like a study plan through Khan Academy of doing a few hours like every other night and then taking a practice test every weekend.
Nice. I like it. And what are your other obligations between now and August 29th?
I have a few.
Okay. What are they?
I am going to be moving in the middle of August, which is like a big worry of mine and part of the reason why I'm not attached to August 29th, just because that's obviously a huge time commitment. That's really the biggest one that's sort of at the forefront of my mind.
So the idea of taking it in August 29th, and we're speaking now about 1 month prior to that. So does that give you anxiety? Does that feel like it could work? Maybe. How do you feel about it overall?
How do I feel about the August 29th test?
Yeah.
I feel a little shaky just because I think I have a lot of test anxiety to get over. So like this is diving into other things, but I generally like am not performing as well in in reading comprehension and the logical reasoning as well as I did like at the beginning when I started studying or when I took my first diagnostic even. And so I think like there's sort of been this like, I don't know, counter effect to like studying where like the more I see the issues that I encounter, the more I sort of like self-fulfill. And so I think again, like it'll be really important to see how I perform on the next like couple practice tests I take, like the full practice test to see if I can sort of overcome some of that test taking anxiety. So yeah, a little shaky.
Okay. Okay, I think that's a reasonable approach. I want to play a game with you for a second. Let's pretend one of two things. Let's pretend that you're not currently registered for August 29th. Mm-hmm. Would you register for it today?
Oh gosh, that's a good question. I guess my first inclination is to say no. But if I want to apply this cycle, I think it's best to take the test in August and see what my score would look like, which I guess is why I would probably register anyways, even though I don't think it's like the best course of action, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I hear that. And I'll give my answer on that in a moment, just from a practical perspective as to what I know about admissions. But before I do that, I want to play a different game with you. Let's pretend that the August 29th LSAT was canceled completely, not even a flex. It's just off the menu. The next available LSAT is October 3rd. How do you feel about that? Admissions considerations and timeline aside, I'll get to that in a moment.
Okay. That would be great if I could just take it in August. Yeah.
Do you mean August or do you mean October?
Oh, sorry, I mean October.
Okay. Well, I'll just jump in with a fact for a moment, which is that October is perfectly fine. You don't need to do August 29th. October 3rd is okay. Yes, all else being equal, applying marginally earlier is a tiny bit better. But if it's giving you anxiety to take it a month from now, and you believe that you could do even just a couple points better by doing October 3rd, it's totally fine. Even November would be okay. January becomes a little bit iffy, but October and November are totally fine.
Do you think, sorry, I don't mean to command time.
No, that's okay. That's okay.
But do you think that, like, if I really would like to have like the best positioning for getting financial aid or like merit scholarships, that your answer would stay the same?
Correct. Yes. October and November are still perfectly fine for merit aid for scholarships. Yes, it's true that as time goes on, it becomes a little bit less available. It does work against you slightly, but again, if you can get even just a couple points more, totally worth it. Things do change when you get into the following calendar year, meaning you're taking the LSAT or you're applying in January. So it does diminish over time, but again, August versus October, there's not really a significant difference there because both of those are so early. And by the way, just as one comment about you're not wanting to take up time, It's fine. Be selfish here, because allowing us to go deeper is actually serving everyone else here in this room and everyone else who's watching this later as well, because your questions apply to everybody else who's on right now. Everybody else here, I'm expecting, is applying to law school sometime soon, very likely this cycle. And so all of this is relevant to everyone else as well.
Thank you for answering my questions.
Of course, sure, Dana. And by the way, even when you're not being coached by me directly here, everyone watching, take it as if you are being coached, because you can benefit, especially those of you live with me on this call right now. There's a certain energy to this conversation, and all of you can feel free to bring in your questions and concerns as well. And think about how might you have asked this question? What might you have responded when I was asking Dana these questions about how you feel about August versus October? All of that is very relevant to deciding between any two particular test dates. And thank you for playing with me, Dana. Oh, Jackie, I want to acknowledge you as well for answering Ian's question. So I want to give you the floor now to ask any questions or challenges that you're facing, and I appreciate you.
Thank you. So I found that sometimes with the logic aims, like I skip over a rule or something like that, and it's like very frustrating to me that like I'm skipping over rules, and like if I get like a logical reasoning question wrong, it's because like I misread the question. Like I have procedure down. I'm studying like 12 to 15 hours a week, and I'm scoring in the upper 160s, lower 170s, but I'm not confident that that will transfer over on test day, especially because of nerves. So like my biggest problem area is like making sure that I'm like reading carefully. But oddly enough, like that doesn't happen in reading comprehension. I usually get that right.
Okay, no, thank you for asking that. So you mentioned, Jackie, that you have procedure down. What does your procedure look like?
So I read like the paragraph first. You know what I mean by the paragraph?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I read that, and then from that I like try to take out like different rules I know like that I need to like include, for example, like numerical distribution or something like that, right? And then I go on to like each question, and like for the first question on my paper I write 1, and then I write down like what that means and like variables and things like that, and then I keep going. But like for some reason I don't understand, like sometimes I miss like a rule. It's not even an inference, it's an actual rule.
How long do you spend on this setup?
2 to 3 minutes.
Okay. I think most people spend around 2 to 3 minutes. I heard earlier Ian and Dana were both saying around that amount of time. That's a reasonable amount of time. So where is that time largely being allocated?
Inferences.
Okay, so after you've drawn the main diagram, looking to connect the rules.
Mm-hmm.
But it's possible that a rule gets left out, or it's possible that a rule maybe gets
or I don't even write it down.
Okay.
No, I don't misinterpret the rules, but
Not
like
even that,
sometimes I don't even write it down. And
Okay.
I don't know. It's not carelessness, but it seems like carelessness. So I don't know what's happening.
Do you ever double check? Do you ever do things twice?
Yes, but like I'm finding like after this week I just did logic games, and like I'm finding that like sometimes I don't double check, or like if I double, I don't know, like I don't know.
Okay. Well, let's see this. Have you ever gotten several questions wrong in a game because you missed a rule?
Yeah.
Okay. If I was going to remove $10,000 from your bank account every time you made a mistake on missing a rule, what would you do differently?
I would check. I would double check.
If I told you I was going to remove 5 points from your LSAT score because you missed a rule, what would you do differently?
Double check.
Yeah. That's it.
But I worry about like the amount of time that would take. And I know that like that's not necessarily rational, but it's a
How
worry.
long do you think it would take?
I don't know. Like 10, 15 seconds.
Maybe. Only one way to
Maybe
find
more.
out. But there's only one way to find out for sure. But
Right.
you said also 2 to 3 minutes on the entire setup. Most of that being on inference making after
Right.
the process. So that means that the majority of 2 to 3 minutes, meaning at least a minute to a minute and a half, is solely on the inferences, meaning that it definitely takes less than a minute to a minute and a half to simply check the rules the first time.
Mhm.
And probably a double check might go faster than the initial check because it is the second time.
Right.
Most
Right.
of the rules you already have down. Most or all of them, maybe just one is missing. You also mentioned numbering the rules. Did I catch that correctly?
Yeah. Especially because like you can't write on the virtual screen. So like I always like make sure that I do my logic games on scrap paper, because on the actual test, you're not gonna be able to write on the actual like paper. And for
Right.
me, like writing on paper is easier.
Yeah.
So I just make sure I do that.
Sure. Now you're saying rules. I assume you mean the indented parts under the paragraph. Is that correct?
Yep.
Okay. So you're missing something from there, right?
Yep.
What about rules that are in that initial paragraph? Sometimes there are things buried in there too, right?
Yeah. I mean, usually I'm able to catch them, but sometimes not. But like this week I like spent a lot of time like making sure I could do that.
Nice.
Just drilling that.
Good. Do you ever find yourself in a position where you could memorize the rules?
I feel like that would take too much time, and that's not necessary.
Agreed. It's not necessary, and it would take a lot of time. The reason I bring this idea up is just as a concept, as a game to play with yourself. Logic games really test your short-term working memory. They push beyond those limits, which is why it's so easy to make a mistake. If you think about it, what can we hold in our heads? A decent amount, but not that much. That's why phone numbers are chunked. You have area code, then 3 numbers dash 4 more numbers. They're separated, and it's hard to memorize lots of phone numbers. That's why we live with our phones. The phone books are very useful, right, inside our cell phones. But the number 7 numbers is probably the most you could reasonably get, which is why they put those dashes there to make it a little bit more manageable. Logic games, they're pushing beyond those limits as reasonable limits as well. And obviously all of it's extremely arbitrary and random.
Right.
So pushes beyond those limits. But as an exercise, it might be useful to see, could you diagram all the rules and then look away and write them all down without even looking? It's possible. I mean, maybe not the first time you see a game, but the third or fourth time, more reasonable. I mean, I could spit out the rules for a number of games just simply because I've done them so many times. They've actually gotten baked into my long-term memory, which is useless in most contexts, but for the LSAT, it happens to be useful. But I want you to just play with that idea, because it could be useful going through an entire game to not have to look back all the time. If at least a couple of rules were burned into your memory, that would be a useful thing to have going on.
I don't know if I would trust myself with like nerves. Do you know what I mean? Like I might misremember that.
Yeah, you might. And obviously it's hard enough in the context of simply studying on your own time, let alone under the stress of a timed section, even more so when it's the real thing on test day. So I'm not saying that you have to get there, but it could be a place to play. And that could be a place to see, are you getting everything down at the beginning? Because if you were trying to memorize them, I guarantee you would be reading those indented rules a lot more seriously. You would be checking through them a lot more, and you would be extracting your interpretation of them as you were writing them down on scratch paper.
Right.
There's simply a place to come from. If you were trying to enter one of these crazy memory competitions, how would you go about interpreting those rules? Just a place to play.
Also, just a follow-up question. How do you know like when it's better to like draw out like the inferences on like the number line, for example, versus like doing the templates?
That's a whole separate question. And part of that simply comes down to judgment and familiarity.
Okay.
You got to play with that. If you want to see how I do that, watch my video explanations. I've got them for nearly 200 logic games on YouTube. I'll throw the link in the chat for those who aren't aware. These are also all on the YouTube channel. I have playlists devoted to them.
Okay. And then, sorry for monopolizing.
Don't apologize.
Don't
apologize.
So like transferring that technique to logical reasoning and making sure I understand the question being asked. What's a good way to do that?
You mean the question stem?
Yes.
Where don't you understand it being asked? In what context?
Like for example, sometimes like I mix up like the sufficient and the necessary assumption, but then when I look back, I'm like, oh, it's obviously this one. I don't know what I was thinking.
Yeah. I've got plenty of resources on that on the YouTube channel as well as the blog. Just search difference, necessary assumption versus sufficient assumption. I've gone over it. Comes down to
But that's just an example. Like,
yeah.
More like, yeah.
I mean,
Okay.
I could say familiarity and I could say drilling, but
Right.
I've also, for any specific example, I've got it covered in my resources. I've got it covered in the YouTube channel. I've got it covered on LSAT blog. I've got it covered more inside my courses, but it comes
But
down to
it's more about misreading, not misunderstanding. Misreading.
also, I'll say the same thing. What would it take? What would it take for you to treat it seriously enough, where you slowed down if there were consequences associated? Which, of course, there are. Not going to sugarcoat
Right.
that.
Right. Okay. Like slow down and like be more patient with like what's going on and like double check and things like that.
Yeah,
Okay. Perfect. Thank you.
of course. And if that doesn't work for you, circle back to me and we'll find another solution for it.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Jackie. Thank you for playing full out. I appreciate it. Amanda, you raised your hand. Let's bring you in. What's going on for you?
Hi. I'm struggling a lot with inference questions. I've spent probably the most of my time studying for the LR section on them. And the ones that I guess might seem harder that have like a lot of different diagrams or conditionals, I studied like diagramming those and I can get those very quickly. It's the ones that you can't necessarily diagram that I have a really hard time doing. So I guess I'm wondering, what do you think would be the best strategy for those? Because I don't think it's a lack of like studying them enough. I think I'm not studying it correctly.
Sure. So when you spend a lot of time, how are you approaching them?
I'm doing a lot of drilling questions, and I'm spending time like going back to all of the inference questions when I do a time section or even a practice test on them. And sometimes even after they've given me the correct answer, I just don't see how they came to that conclusion.
Yeah, I hear you. Do you try to prephrase?
On the inference questions, yes, but I feel like I can only do that when I have a diagram.
Yeah.
When I've written out a diagram.
I hear that. Yeah. I mean, that definitely lends itself more to diagramming. In the absence of prephrasing, what's your next step?
I go through each one individually. So these questions tend to take me the longest. And I think I'll like go through each question individually and try to see if it makes sense. And then usually I just answer like a trap answer because I'm confused.
Where do these questions fall within this section? Like what number question are they?
It's not even necessarily like the most difficult in the middle. It can just be like any of the inference questions.
Yeah. I mean, in the absence of a prephrase, it might just be evaluating the choices. It could simply be checking each one against the stimulus to see if it is a reasonable inference, to see if it's supported by the stimulus. In the absence of, prephrase, there's not really much else to do. If you can see a connection between two parts, that's fantastic. As you said, formal logic lends itself to that very neatly. In other cases, it might just be connecting two parts in a non-formal logic way if there is some degree of overlap between two different parts. There, for example, there's one question where it talks about 500 million years in one section of it and then 100 million years in a different section of it. And due to the context of that question, there is overlap between those two facts because there's no overlap in terms of their time ranges. And so it's possible to make an inference on that basis. But again, could just be scanning through the choices, looking for matches.
Okay.
One thing I'll say is, I'll ask you is, does it relate to, do you check the choices against each other ever?
Sometimes when I'm only down to 2, but not necessarily.
Okay. Yeah. I would recommend really just more review of those. Okay. There's not really a magic technique for those sorts of questions, but I will refer you to what I call the Socratic review method. And the Socratic review method is a method of really digging deep into your understanding of why you get something wrong or why you have difficulty with something. And when it comes to tempting wrong answers and discouraging right answers, there's a lot to play with there.
Okay. And also, for the other questions, I'll maybe get like 1 or 2 other question types wrong or in general. But sometimes I won't, it'll just be inference. So what would be, obviously I'm aiming to get 0 wrong in a section, but if it's taking away time from studying bigger things or it's taking up too much of my time, should I just be okay knowing, okay, I can probably get 2 inferences wrong and then that'll be it? And then should I just kind of move on from that?
Well, inference questions come up quite a bit. So they're not a type I would write off. Like, let's say we're playing the triage game and the exam's coming up pretty soon and you want to spend less time on something. Let's spend less time on the things that give you the most trouble, that are the least frequent. So balance the most difficulty with this, and it happens to come up fairly uncommon. Is there a type like that comes to mind for you that you might want to put aside to focus on other things?
Not necessarily. I don't think so.
Okay. Well, if inference is what comes up for you, then I would say stick with it, because it actually is one of the most common logical reasoning question types. You have must be true, most strongly supported being the most common manifestations of that. You also have cannot be true. Okay. If there were a type that many people might want to put aside, I would say parallel reasoning and parallel flaw are, for many people, extremely difficult and fairly rare, to the point that I wouldn't invest tons of time on that if there are more common things that also give you trouble. So anybody who has trouble with both inference and parallel reasoning might want to spend more time on inference.
Okay.
But when's your test date?
I'm shooting for end of August, but I can also do October if I'm not 100% confident.
Yeah, either way, August versus October, you still have plenty of time to work on inference, and you will organically come across a lot of them, even in the context of doing individual sections and full-length exams.
Okay.
Anything else going on for you we could support you on?
Just logic game in general, not so much on accuracy, but just on timing. When I started, I could only do like 2 games and maybe not even that. And now I can do 3 games regularly. And my accuracy is about like 0 to 2 wrong on the 3 games that I am doing. But even if I have time left over, it's like 30 seconds max. And I feel like I'm already pushing the limit of how fast I can do the games. So I don't know how to make that jump to a 4th game.
Yeah, it's a common situation, 3 games versus 4. Anybody on the call right now have any support for Amanda or any ideas for Amanda around getting to that 4th game and solving it with sufficient time?
Just a tip from like my perspective. It might seem like counterintuitive, but if you work on the easier games and you can get like shortcuts and things like that, and just like almost like understanding like the patterns, then like you can get to a place where those are shorter and you have time for the longer games. Like it's not fair to think to yourself that you have to get every single game done in 8 minutes and 45 seconds. Like some are going to be less, some are going to be more. And just like understanding that and like being patient with yourself.
Okay. Yeah. I definitely noticed that like for sequencing, I do those shorter, but because it's so much easier for me, I haven't spent enough time practicing. And I guess you're right. If I do that and I can get those down to like 6 minutes or 7 minutes, and I have more time for the harder ones. Thank you.
That is exactly right. So 8:45 is simply an average. I would never time individual games because they vary in difficulty. Some games that are easier could take as little as 6 minutes. That's actually realistic for a lot of games. And other games may take 11 minutes or 12 minutes, and that's perfectly fine. So, for example, let's say the Birds in the Forest game, test 33 game 2. That is a difficult conditional in-out game. It's difficult in general, but in the world of the LSAT, that's actually a relatively easier game where anybody with enough studying could get that down to 6 minutes. However, a tougher game like the CDs game, Test 31 Game 2, featured in Legally Blonde with the used in new CDs, that game, it's totally fine. And if that takes 11 or 12 minutes for anybody on a first look, I can show you ways to get it faster, but looking at it cold, 11, 12 minutes, totally reasonable. So never time individual games. And best, if you're doing them timed, I would say only do it in the context of a timed 35-minute section, or more if you've got extra time, but do it under realistic test day conditions, only the 4 games in the section as it's published.
Okay.
Practice like game day, especially in this final month for August.
Okay. Thank you.
No, thanks for playing, Amanda. Appreciate it. Amarachi, what's going on for you?
Hello. One big thing for me is I just took the LSAT Flex July. And so the biggest thing for me was like my timing, I would say. I probably should have did more prep tests. But also like a big thing for me is like the reading comprehension area, because I am like more of a slower reader. So like I don't really know how I can like get to everything at like one time, like, or in like 8 minutes, I guess, the whole like section.
I hear you. Okay, so with regard to the timing, I'll share the same idea I shared before. 8:45, just an average. So 8 minutes, again, there's variation in difficulty. So I wouldn't time individual passages. I would only time them in the context of a full section. Some passages are easier than others. We've covered that already, so let's put that aside. What else could you support with in terms of your approach to reading comprehension? Or to ask it a different way, how do you approach a reading comp passage right now?
Right now I pretty much go through the passage, like reading the passage, and then I kind of like go through the questions and go through whichever one I think is kind of easier to answer first. So normally like the shorter ones, I guess, I kind of go through those first because they are a little easier to me than the more lengthier ones. But that's really it. Like, and also sometimes I feel like I have a little bit of trouble like remembering like certain stuff from the passage as well.
So tell me more about how you approach a passage. When you read it, are you taking notes? What are you looking for? Are you making any sort of annotations on the passage or on your scratch paper?
Yeah, sometimes I take notes like after each like paragraph that I read, but then sometimes I feel like it kind of takes up too much time, or like I'm writing too fast, so I can't really remember. Like, I don't know, like I'll write it down too fast and I don't have enough time, I feel like, so I kind of stop. And so, yeah.
Okay. Okay, so what leads you to take notes versus not take notes?
I feel like taking notes will help me remember, like more so like each area that I just read, because like sometimes it's harder when you're like getting new information in like the next, you know, paragraph and like stuff like that. But it's just more so I feel like it does take up time writing it out.
Yeah, it does. It's a trade-off.
Yeah.
I want to ask you more specifically, though. You said there are some times where you take notes, and then there are other times where you don't take notes. So I'm wondering what is involved in making that decision for different passages.
If I feel like the area that I'm taking notes on, like normally I feel like that area is like more like important. I guess it's more like the main idea of like the passage. So that's where I'll like normally write it down.
Okay, I hear you. And how long do you spend on taking these notes, and how long do you spend on your initial read?
I'm not really sure how long I take on the notes per se, but like reading it, I'll say it'll take me like anywhere from like 3 pushing like 4 minutes just for like reading it. Yeah.
Okay. And then do you find that it becomes a bit of a time crunch with the questions? I heard from you that you were kind of running out of time.
Yeah, I do. I feel like I definitely like run out of time by the time I get to the questions and things of that sort.
Okay. Are there ever situations where you feel like there was some time that you used on that initial read through or note taking that didn't end up serving you?
Yes.
Okay. So what areas might that be?
Sometimes like when I write stuff down, I feel like it might not have been as important as I thought it was. And so sometimes when I get to the actual questions, like sometimes I might think the main point, for example, like I might think the main point or the main purpose of the passage really was, like I thought it was that, but it really wasn't. And so like that was kind of like what I wrote down, and then I go back to the questions and I noticed I was kind of off. And so it seems like it was a waste of time basically.
And so do you feel like you start to get a sense of when that note-taking doesn't serve you?
Yeah, when I get to the questions, normally.
I guess what I'm asking more is, do you feel like through this process, you could learn what sort of note-taking serves your understanding and what sort of note-taking does not serve your understanding. So
I
you can
guess
develop
like
an intuition for it.
I guess like if I do it more, then I can figure it out. Because I do know like I didn't really focus on reading comprehension as much because I kind of like felt like at first, well, like I read all the time, so it's like it wouldn't be like where I needed to focus on as much. So I really focused more on like logical reasoning and logic games. But then later on, like when I started like going through it, I noticed that I'm kind of like struggling there the most.
Yeah. And when are you taking the LSAT?
Well, I just took it in July, so I was planning on taking it again in like maybe October or November to give me more time to really like prepare again and hopefully be the last time I'll take it.
Yeah. So you've got some time to experiment.
Mhm.
If you're going for October, you've got over 2 months. So I would be thinking about developing a consistent note-taking strategy as well as a consistent approach and an idea of where to allocate time and what to look for. Reading comprehension is more personal than any other section of the exam because you've been reading your whole life. You've been reading in different contexts. You've done reading comprehension on perhaps the SAT or the ACT or other standardized exams, or even simply in high school and college. A lot of it's a lot of reading comp. So not just one strategy will work for every single student. I typically find those who do the best in reading comp tend to mark and write down very little or not at all. So I would tend towards less, but it could serve you to write down something.
Okay.
So I'd suggest do a handful of passages one way, a handful of passages the other way, meaning do a handful where you write down nothing at all. Do a handful where you take some minimal notes. Do a handful where you use the annotation tools, clunky as they are, like the highlighting and the underlining on the digital LSAT site on Law Hub, for example, and see what feels the best for you and what gets you the highest accuracy rate. So I'm not going to simply just give you the answer like this is the way to go about it. I'm going to suggest experimentation and then seeing what works in the end.
Okay.
There are a couple of drills I recommend for you. One is read a passage, take some notes, and then attempt the questions using only your notes and your memory. This is obviously not realistic. You will be able to go back to the passage on test day, but as an exercise, how would you engage with the passage differently if you weren't going to be able to go back to it? How would you read differently? And still take only a reasonable amount of time on that initial read. Obviously, with this drill, this is untimed. You might take 20 minutes on a passage versus that theoretical average of 845 that you should never actually hold yourself to. Maybe it takes 20 minutes, maybe you take 30 minutes, but as an exercise, you're really digging into the depths of your memory. I talked to Jackie about this in the logic games context. Could apply differently here. But again, just a place to play around. You could also take some simple summaries, use only your summaries. You could take more detailed notes and use only those notes. You could aim to simply read for the main idea and knock out those questions. All the general global nature questions.
All right. And I have one more question. So like, since I did like just take it and I already kind of know like it's not the score that I wanted to still start on like my application, like whole application process. So that way when I take it the next time, I'll pretty much have everything, like my letters of recommendations, everything. So I've been kind of like thinking about what I want to do for my personal statement. And I just wanted to know, does it really have to be towards like why you want to be a lawyer? Or can it be like on something else, on like more so like how you've grown as a person, I would say? Or does it have to be like law related?
It's both of those are totally fine. It's a personal statement. Why law school is obviously a good thing to talk about. Getting personal, sharing your story, also a good thing to talk about. I go into this a lot more in the personal statement workshops. I published 2 of them on the LSAT Unplugged YouTube channel under the law school admissions playlist. They're each over an hour. We go through real personal statements. I share some general thoughts on personal statements as well. So I would refer you there to go deeper on that.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Amarachi. Well, folks, we're about a little over an hour here, and we've covered a lot of great ground tonight. I've shared a link to my courses in the chat for those of you looking for more sessions like this. Obviously, we all don't know each other here. This is kind of just a first meeting with folks in the community. But if you're looking for more of this sort of thing, but on a deeper level, develop a community of like-minded students, use group coaching sessions. I run them every 2 weeks. It's inside my course, and they're a lot of fun. We typically go an hour and a half. We cover all different areas, and I'm continually playing with the formats of those sessions. And so it's a continually evolving process, and you could be part of it. And I take your needs and questions into consideration when crafting future formats, future class materials. So keep an eye out for that. If you're interested, check out the link, and feel free, of course, to reach out with any questions. Happy to help you all however I can. And thanks to each and every one of you for showing up tonight and playing. Those of you especially who joined and asked questions and engaged with me, I really appreciate your participation and engagement. And keep in touch, all. Have a great night, and I'll hope to see you all soon. Thanks for joining. Thanks for tuning into the show. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already to be notified of new episodes as I release them. And feel free to reach out if you need anything at all as you move forward with your prep. I'm happy to help however I can. In the meantime, I'll wish you all the best and take care.